Welcome to class. I'm Trevor and I post D&D videos every week, generally on Wednesdays. This is my third video in the class inspiration series, where I take Magic the Gathering cards and use them as inspiration for your next D&D 5e character. In this video, I'm going to focus on druids. I've already covered artificers and bards in previous videos. This video is going to come into three parts. The first part, I'll run through just a bunch of magic cards, and I'll talk about how those cards could inform your next 5e druid. In the second part, I'll talk about the three published crossover sourcebooks, which are Ravnica, Theros, and Strixhaven, and talk about druids in those settings, in case you're playing in a game that takes place in one of those worlds, or if you want to just use that as further inspiration. And in the final part, I'll talk about some additional Magic the Gathering blocks that you could search through to kind of narrow your focus and maybe find some inspiration for your next druid in 5e. Before I get ahead of myself, I want to give a bit of an explanation. There are a lot of druids in Magic the Gathering, but the crossover between the fiction of Magic and the fiction of 5e is not the best Venn diagram. You see, in Magic, most of the druids produce mana, which is the resource that's used to cast spells. So if you're looking for a druid, like a very cliche circle of the forest land druid that is an elf, and who's really imbued with forest and maybe a protector of nature, there are a ton of examples of specifically that. When you come to the other kinds of druid circles, it gets a little bit more shaky, and especially when you start to take into account wild shape. There are not, at least from my investigation, there are not that many cards that have or mirror that mechanical ability in 5th edition. And if they do, they're not druids, they're werewolves or shapeshifters. And that complicates this quite a bit. There's one really good example, Circle of the Moon Druid from the Adventures of the Forgotten Realm set, and that doesn't count, right? I can't use D&D to inspire D&D. So just keep in mind that my inspiration might be a little bit out there, and if you're looking through Magic cards, you might find inspiration from a druid in an otherwise unfamiliar place. I'm going to run through a handful of Magic cards, and I'll talk about how they could inform your next 5e druid, and we'll start with Eudora Gravegardener. Eudora is a treefolk druid, a legendary creature in Magic the Gathering, and when your creatures die, they return to the battlefield as forests. I really think that this does a great job getting across this almost ultimate druid desire, at least for some druids, to keep kind of repopulating and reforesting, maybe even rescuing their lands or their home, reclaiming nature from civilization. So I really think that this is a strong example of a Circle of Lands druid that also deals with the cyclical nature of life and death. And I think it's cool to see a non-elf and even non-human druid, right? A treefolk druid, I think, is a really cool idea. And there are going to be some other pretty cool examples like that later on in the video. Next, we have Occam Stonewaker. Occam Stonewaker, to me, fits really perfectly in this fiction. It's not a druid in the forest sense of a druid, but it is still a magic individual who is directly tied to nature. It just happens to be that the nature is manifesting on mountains rather than in forests. Next, we have Mycologist. Mycologist is, to me, a perfect example of a Circle of Spores druid. There's a really clean overlap between that circle and Magic, because there are a lot of Magic cards that deal with spore counters and sapperling tokens, and I think the art of this, and even just the kind of personality that's evoked by this character, someone who's almost clerical, in their clerical as in of a cleric, in their like study and care and craft for something that would otherwise be treated as refuse or garbage or a nuisance, that to me seems very druidic and beautiful. I love the art on this card. I really, it makes me want to play a Circle of Spores druid, personally. We go from a more serious example of a Circle of Spores druid to a more goofy one with Grumgully the Generous. Grumgully is a legendary creature that it obviously deals with funguses. I mean, like, he's holding some. But this to me seems like a druid that has more of a freewheeling personality, maybe is more fun, like I said, more goofy. And I wanted to show that as well, because I think that there is, sort of like with rogues, I think there is some assumption of the kind of seriousness and stoic nature of druids, and I don't think they have to always fall into that cliche. For the next card, we have Archelios, the Lagoon Mystic. This might seem weird. This card isn't like type lined as a druid. It's technically a shaman, but this to me seems like a Turtle Dreams druid. This very slow, methodical pace seems very fitting for the Circle of Dreams kind of playstyle. And again, much like I was mentioning earlier with the Treefolk example or Grumgully previously, I really like using more uncommon race class combinations, and I think a Turtle Druid is a really awesome example. And I don't know, I saw this and there's just something so evocative about the art itself and how the art gets across that fiction of being slow and meticulous and methodical, and that just screams Circle of Dreams. And next we have Averna the Chaos Bloom. This card really made me want to homebrew a wild magic druid subclass. There's a lot to say about like elements and elemental energies when it comes to druids, but there isn't a subclass or a circle that fits that really well. But Averna's card does kind of get that evocative nature across, and it makes me want to play a druid in that style. Even if you had to multiclass, even if you had to do like wild magic sorcerer and druid, it might not be excellent in terms of min-maxing, but I think the role play could be there. I want to play a druid that kind of flows with the chaotic elements of nature, and at least through looking through the circle list thus far, it doesn't seem like that is currently an option, but I'd love for it to be one. And the next two examples that I have are Atla the Nest Tender and Gavi Nest Warden. These two examples to me scream Circle of Shepherd Druid, in that they take care of young wildlife. It also seems like a good way to combat the normal conflict that comes up about like, has your druid ever seen a dinosaur? These two definitely would have. And if you're playing in a world where that's possible, I say run with it. I think a druid that maybe grew up on the outskirts of a dinosaur colony or dinosaur enclave and maybe got an egg and tried to nurse it back to health, but some poachers came and stole it, and that's their plot hook, that's their like reason for questing. I think that that's a great idea, and it's inspired by the art and flavor of these two cards. All right, now that we've run through some specific cards, let's look at the 3 published Magic sets so far and talk about druids on those particular planes. We'll start with Strixhaven. In Strixhaven, the 2 colleges to me that seem the most druidic are first and foremost Witherbloom. Witherbloom is the black-green college. It has to do with the circle of life and death and decay. There are, like Diana Soul Steeper, there are examples of Witherbloom druids that automatically fit the bill. So I think that if you're really wanting to play a druid in a Strixhaven game, my first college of choice would be Witherbloom. But second, I would probably go with Quandrix. This might seem a little strange, although the inclusion of green should kind of make things make more sense. But Quandrix is the math school, but it's the nature of mathematics and how life is mathematic. And I mean, even one of the deans from Quandrix is considered a druid. So I think if you don't want to go the kind of life and death route of Witherbloom, the nature and mathematical elements of life from Quandrix could also easily fit the bill. Next, we look at Theros. And on the plane of Theros, I'd be remiss to not talk about the Circle of Stars Druid. Now, the Circle of Stars Druid, I believe, was originally published in that source book, and it makes sense. Theros is all about mythology, and there is this mythological connection where the druids of Theros are star beings. Instead of using their wild shape to turn into animals, they can turn into stars. This is manifested on some of the cards. There are enchantment creatures in Theros that have that same constellation pattern that matches the quote-unquote god cards of Theros as well. I really love this. There are also some other cards on Theros that do a really good job of showing whether it is a godly boon or a connection with nature that is missing from a lot of other magic cards, right? You have like Aspect of the Manticore, for example, that shows someone like modifying part of their body in an animalistic way that to me screams druid and is a really good example. I wish there was more magic cards like this, especially creatures that were like this, because I think that it would have really helped for inspiration for Circle of Moon druids. And finally, for the published crossover material, we have Ravnica. On Ravnica, I would look at the Gruul and the Golgari. These two are, again, green in color identity, and the Gruul clan is barbarians and beasts, and I think you have a lot of really good, I mean, like, in terms of rejection of modernity, you have really good examples of Circle of Moon druids from the Gruul outcasts. And then for Golgari, you have a lot of Circle of Spores examples and like insect druids and swamp druids that I think would be really enriching for a 5e campaign. And for some non-crossover material, if you want some inspiration for your next druid, I'm going to point you in the direction of 2 planes or sets for Magic the Gathering, and the first one would be Ikoria. Ikoria, Lair of Behemoths, was a magic set that was inspired by kaijus. I don't know how well the set itself was received. There was a mutate mechanic where you were actually stacking modifications on top of other cards, which I thought was really cool, but I didn't play a ton at the time. And we have cards like Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. Now, Kinnan is a great example of a druid. He also might be a great example of a beast heart if you saw my review of that class from MCDM. And just across the board, even if you just want examples for like wild things to wild shape into, I can't stress how awesome Ikoria would be for things like that. And finally, I would encourage you to look at cards from Alara. The first set in this block was called Shards of Alara, where there were 5 shards, each with 3 different colors of mana that were joined together in an event called the Conflux. Specifically, Naya, which is red, white, green, and Jund, which is red, black, green, are both examples of planes that had like giant beasts. Jund had dragons, and Naya had huge like behemoths and monsters. Both of these specific shards are really great examples for how humans kind of found their way in this very different ecosystem than what we're dealing with now or what is dealt with on a lot of different planes, or even other planes on Alara. So that's Druids. Hopefully this gave you some inspiration for your next 5e character. If you have other class suggestions, drop them in the comments down below. If you have a favorite card that I mentioned or a different card that could act as inspiration, let me know about that too. I'd love to hear it. If you like this kind of content, subscribe to the channel, and as I always say, be safe. Make smart life choices.